It's on now? Yes, it is. So we got two of these things. Hope I'm not talking too loud. My name is David Cope. I'm senior Shakespeare professor here at the college. Carmen was one of my first students. I'd worked for 18 years as a custodian, and I was the dock manager of Main and North Building at GRCC. My poetry career had taken off, and they hired me on the condition that I get my master's degree. So my first class, I had invented a multicultural literature class, which is now taught by my colleague, Roland Gani, and Carmen came into my class. She was young. She was still learning English, but she had a fire in her like no student I've ever had since. I was worried. In fact, the one thing we've talked about over the years is I was afraid she'd have a heart attack by the time she was 30 because she was moving so fast and so hard. I could give you an academic introduction with all of her degrees, all of her publications and that, but I really don't want to. It's pretty clear. She went through the entire system. I think she's probably the only GRCC graduate who ever got a PhD from Oxford University in England. They call it DPhil, but it's the same thing. So we've got living proof that if you're a GRCC student, you can go places if you've got a fire in your belly. Do y'all follow me here? Okay. So to speak of Carmen, I mean, if I were to talk about it, we talked about a lot of the things that were going on. This memoir won the Bakeless Prize, which is an internationally important prize for memoir, also poetry and fiction too, I think. There's 3 of them. They give it out each year. And it was the sort of thing that I thought was overdue because I knew how powerful a writer she was. And I guess I'm going to turn it over to her at this point in time because I could go on blabbing endlessly, and it's probably best that I don't. Without further ado, Carmen Bugan, my former student, now my master.
Yeah.
Give it a shot. When we get to any question and answer, I can grab that. We'll take it around.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me in the back there, okay? Yes? All right. Well, it's an absolute pleasure for me to return to Grand Rapids Community College, a place which has remained a spiritual home during the past 23 years since my family and I landed in this town via refugee triage center in Rome that first snowy evening in November 1989. And in honor of that arrival, I will read to you the poem Grand Rapids, Michigan, from my book Crossing the Carpathians. And I dedicate this poem to David Cope, my teacher and friend, a great poet and an inspiring figure in the literary community of Grand Rapids, indeed the poet laureate of Grand Rapids, with heartfelt thanks for inviting me back to Grand Rapids Community College. And I also would like to dedicate this poem to the members of Faith United Church of God who will recognize themselves in the poem, I hope. And they were the first people we trusted, the first people my father trusted in 25 years of dissidence. What happened that night is we came after a long, long flight, and we saw a man with a placard with our name written on it. It said Bugan on it. And that was the pastor, Paul Stover. And he is in the photo, in the book there, in the photo insert, you will see one of the last photos, you will see us off the plane with the photo of Paul Stover. We didn't know who these people were. We never met them. And my parents allowed for the family to be split in 2. We went into 2 cars that night. And I cannot tell you what it means for us to be able to make that leap of trust. But I hope today's reading from the book will illustrate that moment. But by the end of this, I hope you will get to know it. So my book of poems, Crossing the Carpathians, is about crossing the Carpathians in many ways, the mountains of Romania. And this is a poem called Grand Rapids, Michigan for David. and for the people of Church of God. Father repeats his own name aloud, as if to remember it. Sheep skin coat, bloodshot eyes, one suitcase. He carries his age and his language on his tongue. Mother gathers us around her. I still see on her face the green lights on a platform in Bucharest, the arm of the conductor lifting to go. When we crossed the frontier, we drank quietly from a flask of plum brandy. I still don't know what each of us was thinking. Someone carries a sign with our name written on it. We don't know him, but embrace him and let him drive us through driving snow. Now, the title of today's talk is How to Write About Personal History When It Is Part of National History. And this is a lot, I'm thinking here about the students who are writers as well. This is more of a question and less a list of prescription, because the subject is, I believe, a lifetime effort for self-definition and understanding. The idea for this talk came from a radio interview I gave a couple of months ago to a writers program in Minnesota. Talking about my book, Bearing the Typewriter, the interviewer asked me if I felt any responsibility or obligation to present Romania and the Romanian community in my book. Having made it clear to her that the story of my family is the story of one family under Ceausescu, I also acknowledged that my family's fight against oppression, though unique in many ways, was also representative. I suppose my ego hasn't developed to the extent to which I believe that I can speak for the experience of a whole nation. But then again, I am part of a nation that struggled with totalitarianism, and this has been the primary subject of my work. Many other people fought against tyranny, suffered in prisons, and ended up thrown out of the country. Many, not only my parents, have fought for freedom and dignity in their own countries and would have preferred to reach old age in their native villages. So yes, I said, the story of my family might be the story of many other families, even though I prefer to look at it from a personal perspective. Once you write a memoir that presents a moment in history, no matter how private and personal your story is, you can't avoid people wanting to categorize it and understand it in its historical context. For this reason, I thought it would be worthwhile thinking about the job of the writer from the point of view of more public responsibilities, even though, as I also insisted in the interview, I don't want to inflate myself to think that I'm capable to speak for everyone else. The great poet Czesław Miłosz once said that there are times in human history when people experience that history so strongly that the eye of the poet, you know, the lyric eye, the one who speaks in a poem, wanders both within the personal biography and also within the larger history. And this is the point I would like to make in this talk today. For me, the issue is linguistic. As a result of my family's persecution under Ceausescu, and in direct response to expulsion from our country, I have chosen to write all of my literary work, and indeed also my academic work, in the English language. In this way, I banished Romanian, the Romanian language, from my life. But have I? Here we go, the roots of my memoir, Bearing the Typewriter. Now, the subject of the book is this. My parents bought an illegal typewriter in Romania. In Romania, during the communist regime, was not legal to own a typewriter unless you registered your fingerprints and the fingerprints of the typewriter with the police. because the government was afraid that people might type anti-communist propaganda and spread it all over the country. My parents bought two. They registered one that I played with. The other one didn't register to the police. And my father ended up burying the typewriter during the day, so the police kept coming to check the one that was legal, and they kept unearthing it at night and typing anti-communist propaganda and spreading them all over the country. After a few years of doing this, my father decided he wanted to do a one-man protest against Ceausescu downtown Bucharest, and he did it. And he went to prison for it, and my mother was forced to divorce, and we're under death threats, and I suffered my interrogations from the age of 12, and we were thrown out of the country as a result of that. So that's the subject of my book. But there is another layer here, is the linguistic, is the attitude to language. Here I am in David Cope's class trying to forget my native language and trying to write my first poems. But guess what? My poems are all about polenta and fried chicken. And they're all about my grandmother. So the subject of my poetry is my childhood, is my memories. We fast forward 20 years. I finish my doctorate at Oxford. I write the thesis on the influence of East European poets on Irish poets, very much related to what I'm experiencing here. And then my husband and I, I was given a creative arts fellowship to, only in Oxford, guys, you can do this. It's only in Oxford, try it, it works well. They give you 3 years of, free food, life in college. If you want to teach, you might teach. If you don't want to teach, well, you don't have to. Your job is to wander around the beautiful English gardens and create. Well, it worked out so well that I got pregnant right away with my first child. My husband got his postdoctoral fellowship in particle physics, also in Oxford. So we started our family. And here comes the crux of the story. I am in the English gardens explaining to my husband, our son doesn't have to learn Romanian. Romania is a polluted country with bad people in it. Look what they did to us. And it's not an important language. Really? As my belly grows, I find myself singing Romanian ballads to my belly, all by myself. Like this. Galbenă gutuie, dulce amăruie, lampă la fereastră, toată iarna noastră. And then, I was reciting to my son the prayers that my grandmother taught me. Doamne, Doamne, cere state, noi pe Tine te rugăm, luminează noastră minte, lucruri bune să învățăm. Că Tu ești stăpânul lumii și al nostru Tatăl ești și pe toate cele bune numai Tu le împlinești. Here I am, a complete hypocrite. Right? It's not important that my son learns Romanian, but everything that is sacred to me, everything that connects me to God, everything that gives meaning in my life goes back to Romanian. So I thought I better write a book about it because this is a long story to tell. My son has to know how comes that we don't go to live in Romania, and yet I am teaching him all these beautiful songs which he will really love. I mean, he will be there tonight, so he might be singing for some of you. Everything that is Romanian. But it's true, it's an attitude to language that has been conditioned by a political reality, by a historical moment. And here's how the eye of the poet wandered into personal history, but also personal biography, but also into personal history. So, now the question was, when I wrote the book, was, wait a second, I have all these memories and I'm very angry. I mean, how do I tell the story? How do you do this? how do you write about the political moment without saying, give me a placard and I want to be like my father, down with the tyrants and the communists? How do I do that? That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is to explain myself to my children and to explain myself to the world, because there are plenty of people out there who ask me, who are you? I mean, now I live in Switzerland. I lived in England for 9 years. I lived in Ireland for 1 year. I lived in the United States for 12 years. And I just go around writing poems about wanting to buy a house somewhere, but I don't know where. You know? I mean, the latest excuse that I found is, I'm an academic. I have to go where the job is. But really, I think it goes much deeper than that. The deracination was so strong in our case that my sensibility cannot attune itself to a place as much as I crave it, as much as I want it. So I decided that it shall be a child speaking to a child. So in my book, you have a 5-year-old girl talking, and this girl talks to you, and she gets older, and she sees more things, and she experiences life, and she comes of age. And there is a mix of naive, and there is a mix of knowing. And there is also, I wanted to give you the sense that this is what it's like to grow up in a totalitarian regime, when you understand and you don't understand your parents' actions, when you understand and you don't understand the historical moment and the political context of what you're saying. But it's a truth, because children can feel more, even though they understand less. And it's a perspective that is not often told. I mean, you have plenty of heroes who tell their stories in their autobiographies. You have the beautiful Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, those 3 volumes. You have all this wonderful work, but you don't have the perspective of a child, which is also disarming. I mean, that perspective of the child doesn't allow me to be angry. Do you know? Because as a child, you don't really understand. You're angry when you're angry, but then, you're also happy. There is something about children which is so resilient. Whatever you do to a child, it will start smiling at the end of the day, because that's what children do. So I decided that was my way into the story. And what I want to do now is I want to read to you 2 excerpts from the book, 2 small excerpts from the book, to show you that, obviously as a child, what I remembered was the magical part of the childhood, which is in the first part of the book, growing up with my grandparents on a farm, milking the cows, making our own butter, learning the rituals of the living, of the dying, of the funerals, the priest being a huge figure, in our lives, the school indoctrination to be against religion, being the first layer of learning to deal with the hypocrisy, I suppose, with the duality. My grandmother said, when you go to church and they teach you that man should believe in a rational power of, his own rational power, and religion is a myth, and all of this, my grandmother said, what do? First, you cross yourself with your tongue in your mouth. This way you clear with God. And then you tell them what they want to do, because otherwise you get punished. So I grew up like that, you see. So what I want to do now, I want to read you one of this idyllic childhood, which has remained for me the most important part, meaning, the well from which I draw all the happiness and all the meaning, has sustained me through exile and all this. And then I want to read you about visiting my father in prison as a result of his protest. And then I think I'll open up to question, because that would be what we'll see. Here is the memories of my first Easter. Time blinks over melting snow. Heads of snowdrops come out of the surprised, warmed earth. Zambile albastre, says Bunica, pointing at the new hyacinth bell in the young grass around the porch. Lacrimioare, zambile albe. She recites the names like prayers to me, and my child tongue rolls over the B's and slips over the A's, as if I'm tasting rose water for the first time. I feel a kind of love for the names of flowers. There is a whoosh of wings above the yard, And Bunica says the migratory birds will return soon. What's migratoare? I ask, weighing the word in my throat. Ah, it's when the stork, homesick for the stub of the oak tree in our backyard, returns home to rebuild his nest. Dor de casă, I repeat, looking at her eyes. And she sings to me the song of the cuckoo bird from Lugoj, who left his village and spent all of his life singing about it from all the roofs of the world, not taking food or water from the kind strangers, because he was sick with home. So we wait for the birds to come home and be healed. I am afraid I will be the cuckoo bird from Lugoj, and I hug her around her soft belly. Suddenly it's Easter Eve. The house smells of baked sweet breads, oven-roasted lamb, and stuffed roasted turkey. Colorful eggs sit in wooden bowls on the tables. Some windows are slightly open, and you can feel the still cold but warming breeze in the air. We must go to bed on a very light vegan dinner and wait for the midnight bells to call us to the church. This year, because I'm almost 6 and Loredana almost 5, my grandparents take us to the midnight service to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Just as I fall asleep, it seems, Bunicu and Bunica turn on the lights and shuffle around the house. They dress in new clothes, dark clothes for tonight, as tomorrow everyone will wear bright dresses and shirts. Loredana and I are blind with sleep, but wake up when Bunicu gives us each candles decorated with tiny white ribbons and lots of pink, red, and blue flowers. For the resurrection, he explains. The 4 of us walk out of the house slowly, leaving on one light in a kitchen to wait for our return. The village is filled with the sleepy "good evening to you" greetings. From every street corner, people come out into midnight like a whispering river, looking up at the stars in the clear sky. Everyone whispers. The church bells toll. From the entrance, even the stern saints in the Byzantine paintings look happy to see us. The priest and his helpers are dressed in magnificent regal clothes of gold, violet, and silver, and the priest holds a tall white candle from which spring fresh flowers that spill over his hands. There is a small light in a church, and then he sings, "Veniți să luați lumina." My grandparents take us to the priest's candle, and we light ours from it. I don't know what I feel. Maybe a sensation that I'm suddenly far inside time. There are tears streaming from my face. This is the first time in my life when a collective emotion, a sort of light, pulses through me, and I understand that something bigger than me is happening, some kind of unity. Everyone smiles, and then hundreds of candles are lit. The service goes on forever. I fall asleep on each of my grandparents. My sister falls asleep on them too, until we are being pushed gently in front of the priest to take communion, when we sing "Christos a înviat," Christ has risen. We walk home with our candles still lit, as does everyone else. At daybreak, our tiny lights, which flicker in the wind, are the stars on earth returning to their beds to sleep. At home, Bunica places a red egg and a coin in a cup, one for each of us, and fills the cup with water. She asks us to wash our hands and faces with the water for good luck, and we sit at the table to eat our boiled egg. We all keep our Easter coin. We go to bed as the birds wake up on Easter Day. I fall asleep, holding Loredana's hands, vestments of gold and purple twirling in the candlelight in my mind's eyes. So, you know, life has a rhythm. Everything was complicated and with many layers and with many rituals, and there was a combination of superstition and religion and all kinds of rituals that we've learned and we internalized. And I think by the time we were 10, 15 years old, we could give you a wise saying about everything. I mean, because, you know, we're always listening to people talking, and they had an explanation for everything. I mean, and my grandma was fantastic with superstition, you know. If your nose itches on the outside, it's a good sign. If it itches on this side, it's a bad sign. If your left eye blinks, that's bad news. If your right eye blinks like this, it twitches, is good news. I mean, it was everything. And then they also interpreted dreams, so, And now I'm teaching my son this. I don't mean to do that, but it's so part of my, Today I woke up and I had a dream last night that the Mont Blanc, we see the Mont Blanc from our kitchen window in Geneva there. And I dreamt last night that Mont Blanc has turned into a volcano, and I was trying to save my husband. And then Stefano woke up and said, "Mommy, I had a dream too. I had a dream too." I was dreaming that I was going to school and I couldn't find my toys that I wanted to take. But you tell me that you'd buy a new one. So, I mean, it's we're all sharing these things. And, it was wonderful. Now, as the food shortages, my parents worked at the grocery store, and as the food shortages have become more difficult to bear, they've become, my father has returned to his earlier political dissidence. And my mother supported him very much, and so they typed those flyers. What I want to read to you now is about my first visit by myself. A cousin was sent with me because I was only 12 or 13. He was sent with me to chaperone me to this. So at this point, my father was not yet condemned. He was kept under the interrogation at the Rahuva prison in Bucharest. My mother was in the hospital with my brother, but she was arrested in the hospital, so she couldn't really go to visit him. And my sister was not allowed to go visit my father because she was the younger of the family. So it fell to me the luck of being the oldest in the family to go to visit him and to bring him some clothes. And that moment obviously is one of those which have also marked me for the rest of my life. I mean, seeing your father in prison after you know that your father is the man who provides food for everyone else, fixes everyone cars and TVs, and is also my daddy who swam with me, on his back in the Black Sea and taught me everything about Ovid and Tristia. I mean, it was a very strong experience, and I want to share that with you. The gates of the Rahuva prison are gray, rusted, and heavier than any wall I have ever seen. They are covered in the dust of the capital's outskirts, coming from construction sites. Comrade Ceausescu and his wife sit around every now and then and move blocks along an architectural board, shifting buildings from one side of the city to the other, building apartment blocks and demolishing churches. The city and its outskirts feel like a giant hive of bulldozers and dust. Fanel, who's my cousin, and I lean towards the small square prison window. We look for the guard. While Fanel introduces us, a terrible iron grating sound comes from the main gate, which glides slowly on its wheels along a small track. I peer inside the courtyard. There are dilapidated buses loaded with criminals coming out. And then there are more criminals who walk into the square gray building. Everyone except the guards wears stripped uniforms and hats that look like those worn by chefs. There are chains around their feet and their hands, so the noise of dragging iron mixes with the dust rising from the earth. The guards yell at the prisoners to move faster. I stand at the mouth of hell, my own mouth gaping open. Dust and images coat my tongue. The thought, my father is a criminal, jumps inside my chest, pounds, screams, and shrieks inside my throat. I taste snot and tears, and I feel hot, shameful, angry tears running over my face. Fanel pulls me inside by the arms, drags me inside the prison. Shh! Come, let's see your father. Don't behave like this now. And suddenly I'm numb, walking along corridors with heavy legs. The reverberating sound of my father's chains on the concrete floor feels like a slap on my face. We face each other through a double window with a microphone in the middle. I run to him. I want to touch him. Please let me hug my father. But there's no way to get to him. His hands are tied behind his back. His prison uniform is striped like the ones I have seen in a courtyard. On the other man, his head is shaved. His cheeks, thin now, look pale. My father is a broken man. He cries as I have never seen him cry. And I haven't a clue what we are saying or what Fanel is saying, other than us telling him about the food and clothing we brought for him, the socks and the shoes. All I see is his face, which towards the end of the conversation returns slowly from underneath the curtain-like tears to the normal, stubborn face of the dad I knew. So that was my first visit to him, and then of course we visited him it was the harshest prison in Romania, at the Aiud prison. And then we were forced to go to Romania. I was the one who went to the embassy, to the American embassy, and sought political asylum for the family. And we were talking about this on the way here. My father dropped me here to the lecture. And we were sharing his memories of going to the embassy as well, and my memories, and how he got arrested, and he got in trouble. And then the question was, we built our house, our little house. That was confiscated for us. There were two things which were confiscated before we left Romania. One was the house that we built with our hands, in which we took a lot of pride. And then the other one was my poetry manuscript. My poetry manuscript, which under the guidance of David Cope has become the first route of crossing the Carpathians. Because this has been, when I wrote it in your class, was between us, and then it was at the borders when I wrote it for my honors thesis with Ken Michalowski. And then it became, after my PhD, crossing the Carpathians. So you see how many years it actually takes to have a book of poems. I mean, it took me many, 10 years, or no, more than that, to actually, to order the mess of life into art. This is the subject of my talk, today. Just to do that, to make that transition from one to the other. And I want to, because I was talking about a linguistic attitude to putting your personal experience, to ordering this mess into art. I want to end today's talk with a poem, a very recent poem from a yet unpublished collection of poems, which I hope will soon find a publisher. It's called The House of Straw, the collection of poems, and it's, again, this has been finished for some time now, but I keep returning to it every once in a while and reworking the poems, and they have to be perfect, because when they are perfect, they reorder my life. And it's another point that I want to make today. You think that the writing, it goes two ways. The writing puts order in your life, and then your life makes your writing orderly. Do you know? The happiness that we've experienced as immigrants in the last 20 years, the gratefulness that we felt and that I feel towards the English language, because here I have come into identity as a free human being who can be happy, and I succeeded. This order, this good life that I call, that we've had here, has helped me order the material in my writing. Without the perspective of time, without the perspective as a physical distance from Romania, I could not have ordered all this mess into a coherent narrative that you can be reading today. But this in returns is putting order in my life, because now here is a version that, it's something which I can hand to my son and say, here you go, this is where you come from. If somebody asks you, there it is. So this is how they're all connected. You can't separate. I mean, I know I was taught at the University of Michigan that you should never look at the biography of the author. You should read the work for what it is. It took me 4 years of doing a PhD and 4 years of teaching in Oxford at the university to unlearn that and to recognize what I think should be time-honored literary criticism, that you cannot separate personal biography from the lyric persona that writes. They are linked together, and I believe in that. I think the creature and the work, you cannot separate them, because the work comes from the creature. That's what it is. I think as a poet, I have chosen to write only in English, leaving Romanian to the past, to the nostalgia and to pain. But creatively, no matter how much I reject my native language, and no matter how much I try to establish a new life for myself as a citizen of the world, I find myself, like in the following poem, yearning for the real names of things. And here's a poem. Sunlight in a water bowl on the doorstep, then on a pond far from home, soarele. Fire in the terracotta hearth, then in a pit outside a tent thousands of miles away, focul. My black sea lulling the shore, then dreams of sea, waking cheeks with stinging salt, marea. Air encircling the grapes outside the window, then gliding with a parachute above a heron, aerul. Soil exhaling after rain through gaps between cherry leaves, then crying dirty tears from roots of a fallen birch, pământul. And I'll take questions now. I know you'll have questions because what I said is strange enough from the experience you must have lived here is different enough that you might be curious to know more. Yes?
Hello. My question is, have your views of Romania, where you come from, changed since you were a child?
Has the country changed?
Have your views of it changed since you was a child? So the way you feel?
The way I feel about, oh yes. I mean, the feelings towards one's country, they change because of the time, because time has passed. So, and like for everyone, this happens for everyone. You know, I mean, you go looking for stuff that doesn't exist anymore. And also has changed because of the experience of living in a different place. I hope that answered your question. I hope I understood it.
I'll do a follow-up on that, Carmen, before I give it off to somebody else. One of the things that, when I read your book, I think it was the second or third time through, I could see that the happy country life in the first half of the book was an illusion, given what was going on in the country and with your family. But there was a part of me that was thinking, this is the seed of beauty that Romania could become. And by planting that on one level, you were remembering the things that are good about the country that it could become again. That was the thing I saw in it anyways. Could you comment on that?
Yes. I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think there was also a review from Scotland on Sunday who said just that. That said, you know, what has remained for this person from her experience in Romania was the love for the country. And I think the love from the country is really encapsulated in the hope that you're pointing to. Mm-hmm. There is a soul in there, which a tyranny or an extended political system cannot really change. And I believe in that. I believe that people were strong enough before that they will regenerate. They will make space for that. And I think that is the extraordinary spirit of Romania. Now, as far as you're saying that was also an illusion, I want to comment on that a bit.
Sure.
Because what I experienced as a child was an illusion, in a sense that, here we go, it's 2010. The government of Romania has allowed me, after many years, to see the secret files kept on my family because of my parents' dissidence. And lo and behold, what do you think I find? I found that my parents were followed by informers from the year I was born. And I found how my mother was forced to renounce her career because he has married a man with a political past. And I found a lot of things which in retrospect, it makes me so happy that I wrote the book when I didn't know about these files. Now, not that my parents and I haven't talked about this, but my parents also had no idea that my father was so severely followed. The most comprehensive way of following and informing on a person, reserved for the most dangerous political criminals. All of those were employed on my father. And in the back of my book, if you look, the first material that I put in the appendix is the dossier that shows you all the different ways in which he, correspondence, informers visiting him at work, asking him questions, provocative questions. They wanted to know, his habits, where he went shopping and how often he was traveling outside the village, all of these things. And they did it as a matter of urgency because where my parents moved, they didn't have enough informers who knew my father, so they had to train new informers to become friends with him. So in that sense, what I have lived has been a child's innocent, unknowing life. I'm glad I got that because I think that is the seed which I hope will bring Romania out. And I also have news for you. 3 days ago, I came back from Chicago. We came with the Amtrak, which was late, so we had to take a bus. We got home at 1 in the morning, all tired, 1-year-old baby in my arms, and my son, and all of this, my mother-in-law, my husband. My mother is awake. We thought, oh my God, it's late, why are you up? She has received her dossier, which in my book I say my father's dossier that I got from Bucharest was 1,500 pages of notes. Well, my mother's is 3,000 pages. And now he's sitting in a living room on a chair on a big pile, and it contains absolutely all the telephone conversations that we've had, especially in the last year in Romania when we were under house arrest. Everything. So now I have an archival identity. Now, my newest problem is anyone in the world can go and search that. Not that we said anything particularly important or dangerous or of interest to anyone, but the fact that your very intimate life, think about the basic things like farting in a house, swearing at someone because you're angry, talking about things like, intimate things about it. They're all state property. Now I have to deal with that now. And so it will take me some time to organize my mind around all of this, to deal with my archival identity. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, here's a microphone.
I see a few hands, but you get them.
I'll try to do good.
I'm just curious about Romanian literature and what you may have had access to as a child, what you may have read, and maybe what you've read after your freedom or your immigration into the United States in terms of Romanian literature.
Yes. So when I grew up, obviously I devoured everything you could find in a library as a child. I focused a lot on Romanian poets and both the totalitarian regime and the people before and now the people in a free Romania. All the three, different systems. They all embrace the poetry of Mihai Eminescu. He is quite well known in the West as well here. And in fact, I did a translation course at University of Michigan as one of my independent tutorials where I translated some of his poems myself as well. We call him our Shakespeare, a romantic poet. And so I was very much into his poetry. There is also Lucian Blaga, another poet, who wrote a lot about village life and about the spiritual sense of, timelessness. I love that, that idea that, you're in one place, you sort of, I think it's very similar to Taoism or Buddhism, when you sit in one place and you feel the energy of the place just going through you, and you become one of the nature. That kind of thinking was very important to me, was very calming to me. Then, of course, we are forced to read all the communist propaganda, all the socialist, realist stuff, which was, my father still remembers, and my mother, that we used to go home and recite all the poems created like a cookie cutter, about Romania is the greatest country in the world, and all the happy peasants are jumping down and marching to the tractors. It was wonderful, So the educational system actually was quite good in one sense. It made us memorize poetry when we were young. So we had to memorize loads of that stuff. It worked well for the brain, even though it wasn't really high literary work. But we also were, you know, they taught us a bit of classical literature, a bit of Latin, and, you know, we learned about the French symbolist poets, for example. So there was a lot of that coming out.
Just as a side comment on that, you can go through Carmen's book. I haven't done it yet. She gives you her reading list in the course of her growing up, what she's reading at every one time or another. And from an American perspective, she was far better educated in some ways than we are, as far as the literature
I
goes.
wrote down what I remembered that I was reading at various times. I mean, it is, again, it's dangerous stuff. Reading Anna Karenina or Crime and Punishment at the age of 14 was Nana,
Yeah.
was a bit, there was democracy in that sense, that nobody really cared what you were reading, even though you were reading about these very heavy philosophical works that could really, you know, mess your mind up if you're too little, if you're too young. But then again, to return to Romania, there was one particular writer who has stayed with me, and I also talk about in a book at the end of the book, when we leave Romania, is Ion Cranga. And every Romanian will tell you about, is a writer from Moldavia who grew up in a village very much like my village, and was full of religion mixed with superstitions, and as a child he was very, very naughty. And at some point, we memorized it so much, my sister and I, this book, Amintiri din Copilărie, which is Memories of Childhood, that we couldn't tell the difference between our life and his life. Do you know, his memories have become ours. So at some point, we didn't know. I mean, I remember I was taking the hatchet, going outside the house, the doorstep, when it was raining, and putting the hatchet on the ground, like this, whap, trying to stop the rain, and doing the chant that he was having in his book. And that was something which I remember in my book as I was leaving. I was chanting prayers to stop the rain, to stop, you know. So a huge, I mean, they have huge importance on our imagination. Since I came here, I've read very, very little Romanian literature. Like I said, I really abandoned the language, and I really abandoned everything. The only book which I have clear memories of reading here is Mihai Ion Pacepa's Red Horizons, which is also in English available. He was the right man of Ceausescu, and he talks about, I mean, here you go. Mine is a personal testimony from the experience of those who suffered and those who dissented. But here, if you read his book, you hear how they did it, how they engineered everything, how they trained. So that's an important document. He wrote his memoirs after he defected from Romania as a result of his disagreement with Ceausescu in a private conversation to start killing people. And he said, I've done a lot of deceiving and a lot of spying, but I'm not willing to actually physically kill anyone myself. So he left his family there, and he sought political asylum in the States. And then he wrote his memoirs. And my father doesn't think much of him. I must also say this publicly, because here's my father, if he hears me talking about this, and I break the rule of the family. So here you have it. My father doesn't think much of him, but I think it's a tremendous document. So, and it's available in English. And that's about it, really. I mean, I threw myself into everything English.
Okay, we got one here, and then there may be some others too. So.
Carmen, you are the real treat, considering the fact that I have experienced nothing like what you've experienced. As you know, my background, being a European in Egypt and being born there. I had an aunt, she was 93 years old. She was a Romanian, but she was born in Egypt, and she was Jewish. And I remember as a kid, she would tell us about Romania because she visited, and she would talk in the examples of people like, what was her name, that famous Magda Lupescu, and some of these famous characters. And I used to have a feeling, having studied a bit about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the spin-off of how Romania would have been something akin to, it was almost like magical as a country. And then, of course, as I got involved in political science, and I read about Anna, what was her name, Anna Pauker, yes, and some of these forefront of the communists. I mean, and then the most tragic example that hit me was the subject of the children who were infected, the children who were infected because of the so-called what was that, blood transfusion that they were given?
The contaminated blood.
Yes. The point I'm trying to make is you're giving me a picture that's almost too mild after what I had read, when I read. So you're being very kind, or is it just something that you hadn't experienced, really, the extent of the extreme violence of that fascinating country that I was being exposed to by my aunt, and then suddenly here you have this experience that you're talking about, but you're being very, very magnanimous or something on that line. But you haven't said much about some of the real brutalities that I've read about. No, are you being cautious about that, or what?
Yeah, I think the two very important points that you're making there, and I can address both of them. My father is able to do a real testimony about the brutalities and the real horrible things that happen. But I want to say one thing. We didn't know about the AIDS, the infection with the needles. We came to United States, and we had people from the church, I think, in fact, from Faith United, or, people and they said, oh my God, it's horrible what happened. We just saw on TV, we saw a documentary about all these people infected. It was so well kept secret that we didn't know as people who lived there. That's one. The other thing, too, is I gave you here really the perspective of a child growing up not knowing. And I think this counts for a lot, for me not going into, and I tried to stay away from that, specifically because not only that a child wouldn't know, but if I were to go into that, to provide more background of all the atrocities that were happening there, I mean, there were so many things, and there were, well, when we were listening to Radio Free Europe, because it's all we find, people setting themselves on fire in city centers, protesting for the government, and we would hear about it. And then, things that I didn't write about in my book. I tried to make it very, very simple. And somebody else made this point. In fact, I had a wonderful review in a literary review in England, and that was written by a journalist who went to Romania in 1985, and he said, their visit there was so orchestrated. He said, I am embarrassed as a Westerner to have been in the country the same year that Carmen and her family were humiliated to see their parents divorce in public because their mother was divorced. I am humiliated that I didn't open my eyes. He said the only thing that bugged him is that the hotel staff was very unfriendly to him. And yet I'm going to tell you another story. I was giving a reading in Chicago at a very famous bookstore. It's the Bookseller, 3 days ago. And there was a woman who was the wife of somebody working for the Department of State in 1984. Very important person who came specifically to hear me. And she said she went to Romania in 1984, and they were invited, they were allowed to travel by themselves, and they were even invited at a wedding, and there was so much food, and there was so much abundance, and there were so many dancing feasts and all this kind of stuff. And there I was saying, have you been in the same country as I have been? Things were so orchestrated. It is 23 years after the fall, and she's finding out in a conversation with me that she hasn't been in the same country she thinks she was. Because as a wife of a very important person, it was the only thing she said was wrong was that the Romanian ambassador in Washington said to her privately, please bring powdered milk with you if you're taking your 6-year-old daughter, because you will not find fresh milk in Romania. And she said, that was odd. And then, in fact, they found food, and I said, are you sure you traveled freely? What they did is they had different kind of acquaintances or friends or people that passers-by, that when they were asking information, they were taking them to the places which were prepared for them. I mean, she was in a monastery where the nuns were taking baths in marble bathtubs. Come on. I was thinking, give me a break, lady. I mean, where have you been? That doesn't, how many monasteries in Romania have that? I've never heard of one, So to answer your question is, I am being very gentle. And I am being very, I'm recognizing the magical of the soul of the people, I think that is timeless. But then I'm telling you also what I have experienced and what my family has experienced. Precisely, this is the title of my talk, because the eye that wanders into the larger history can only go so far. Yeah, there were people who would gladly tell you, my father says, oh, you haven't said about this, but then again, my father needs to give a public testimony about what he suffered and what he saw. He's dying to do this, and it will take somebody who cares, and it will take somebody who can make it public, because he will tell you about the labor camps. He was transferred from one labor camp to another, and he was kept on the train tracks for months, without heating. They would put food in a small little windows. They would have to pee in a little hole, and do that, and then that would. This is a man who I can only tell you what we experienced as a family. It's also out of a sense of honor and respect for him. I have to keep things to what I know and let him have his story, because he suffered.
My question is, you tell such a powerful story, and what is your advice to young people that also have a powerful story to share?
Well, tell it. I think, I was, 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to about 400 students in a high school. And the teacher who invited me to do this talk said, Carmen, now, don't worry. I had everything prepared, and I was armed with papers to read to them, and to give them background on Romanian politics and history and all this kind of stuff. And I was saying, I got everything written down, let me know. And she said, just talk about your life, because that's just fascinating, just to talk about your life. Don't relax. And she said this, they might not know about Ceausescu, about Romania, even about when the Cold War was, because these are young children. They're 14-year-olds. But what they know, when they will know, they will recognize the mechanics of oppression. If they come from a family that experienced violence, that the parents beat each other up, that the parents did drugs, that they lived in a bad neighborhood, if they come from a place where they were marginalized because of whatever reason, and she said that for sure there are people children who have their fathers in jail, or their mothers in jail for doing drugs or something. These people will be able to relate to you because the mechanics of oppression are the same. The way you make another person suffer is the same, no matter what you do. Whether you have a marital dispute or a fight, in a couple or between friends or something, is the same way you do it. So this is what she was saying to me. You will always relate to that, even though the history would not be clear in their heads. And so, to answer your question in this way is to say, the most important thing is to find a way to say it and to tell the story. The other thing I had to think about, and this is again answering your question again, can people really believe everything we've been through? So if I told more, it's too hard to believe. Here I have the archives to prove it, and I put them at the back of the book, and I have, 4,500 pages to prove it for anyone who is interested. But if I were to tell more of what happened to us, people wouldn't believe it. At some point, and we found this also when we moved to the United States, you tell people, and their guys go bigger and bigger, and they go like, oh, that's unbelievable. This really happened to you. So when you tell a story like this that is powerful and is full of pain, be gentle. People might not trust you if you just tell all of it, everything. And sometimes it's enough to say a little thing. I think for me, it was enough to talk about the little girl going through interrogations for you to understand how powerful the totalitarian system was without telling how they beat my father and stretched him on a wall. Do you know what I mean? It's a form of truth. It is the truth. Exactly. The details, you have to really work at the details, because the story is only coherent if you make it coherent. You can't put everything at once. I couldn't tell you all of my life in Romania in 200 pages. I had to select things that will make a narrative. And that's the art of writing. And it's a pleasure that you get out of reading a book, because I also want you to love reading my language. I am a writer. I want to be appreciated for how I write. I don't want to just be appreciated because we suffered. That's not why I'm a writer. You understand? I mean, and I know all the Russian poets, you know, who went to death to the labor camps, and they stood against Stalin because they wanted to express themselves as writer. You don't want to fall in the trap of being put on a pedestal for what you suffered, and then people not to appreciate your writing for your skill with language. If you're a writer, then you're a writer first. Yeah. Well, I wrote an article about this actually because I was under complete shock when I was starting to read to this after. And I said very clearly, and I'm going to sort of develop that, it would have strangled the voice of a child. That voice of a child that you see there talking and prancing and dancing with the horses, it would not have been there. It's not possible to have it there. Now I don't have it anymore. I am an angry person. I'm an angry person that my mother had to have all of her telephone conversations just for being married to a political dissident. I mean, that invasion of privacy, not only that I have experienced that they had the keys to our house, not only that I have experienced that they told us to keep the curtains open so they could walk in, but 30 years later, to find the transcripts of the phone, even though I knew that they registered them, but to find the actual transcripts, I'm angry. And then, I have to, at some point I have to say, but this is because my parents stood up for freedom. And this is part of the course. But then again, when I say this, I don't want to stand up here and say, look how important and how strong we are. I don't want to say that either. Do you understand? I mean, this is so hard. I mean, I don't want to be on a pedestal to say, look at us, we're moral people, the others weren't. And I don't want to say, so it's very difficult. All I can say, Barbie, is the voice of a child would not been there. So I caught it. I think this is God at work, you know? Really, is God at work. Because I caught it and I have it. It was mine. I truly lived it. So even if it wasn't real in a sense that, there was so much happening in the background that I didn't know about it. But now I know a lot more. So lucky me, huh? Yeah.
One thing that captivated me about your story right away was your relationship with your grandparents, and what first struck me is the grace of God that you had them, because who would you be had you not had that early childhood experience with them? Yeah. And then it kind of put me on this path of looking into how different systems can change family structure and how they operate, and all the motivations that may have been in place for your parents to put you in with your grandparents, and the difference of styles that they had. And you speak of your parents as being very authoritarian, and unfortunately during the Ceausescu's reign, they didn't allow any social sciences. So I'm at a loss for finding any research on the effects of the family structure during that time. And so how common was it for children to be raised with grandparents then? How common was it, I guess, were you just lucky, or was that? No.
So this is something that was very important and very difficult for us when we moved to the United States. When we moved to the United States, we found ourselves a nuclear family. When we grew up in Romania, we grew up in a village, and we grew up in an extended family. So what happens is that you grow in the house of your grandparents. Usually the youngest person in the house inherits the house of the parents. And then the house crumbles on one side. And the young couple takes over the gardening, and they build the new rooms in the front of the house, whatever part of the house that is strongest. And that was since time immemorial, Now, things have changed a little bit. My parents were a bit of a modern people, actually, because they took us with them to Nanești, and then they moved back because they couldn't do it. And then we built our own house. But our house was really like a 10-minute walk, or not even 10-minute walk, to my grandparents' house. So people and then we had all the cousins. I mean, I couldn't distinguish between my sister and my cousin Florin that I wrote about in a book. We did everything with Florin. You have all the cousins and you grow up together. And in fact, I was telling my mother-in-law just yesterday, I was saying, because my husband and I were bickering a little bit. And I was saying, oh my God, now you're lucky that you're here because I can talk to you and I can solve the problem between me and my husband with my mother-in-law. Because I said, in Romania, there wouldn't even be, when I grew up, there wouldn't even be space to have a fight with your husband because the whole family is there. So, they solve the problem before you even know you have a problem. That's the thing. Whereas here, people are so isolated, they go crazy trying to solve it. So yeah, the family structure was very much, it was a beginning after 1980s, 1990, I mean, people have moved to the cities, but they always turned back to the villages.
There was somebody in back.
Yes.
Sec, I'll get over there.
Okay. You can shout? Okay.
Talk loud, that'll work. I'll go over here and sit down.
Our experience here in America, when we think about the communist satellite countries to the Soviet Union, is for us, like if you read like a lot of propaganda against it in the 60s and 70s, we call them the godless communists. And there's even a book from a Russian Orthodox writer who was writing about Russian saints and what happened to monasteries under the Soviet
Yeah.
during the Soviet Union. He also calls them godless communists. And then reading your book, you talk about, your priest and your church and your whole, thing with your religion. And from our perspective, we were taught that it's like all religion is abolished, and in the church thing you had to do it kind of like the others, where you do it in secret, and it wasn't allowed. And I understand that each satellite country had its own totalitarian agenda, and
Yeah.
any institution they could utilize to further their image they would use. That just startled me, and I was wondering, were there Orthodox churches that were disbanded or destroyed because they wouldn't meet the agenda of the regime?
So there is Martyrology. It's again, the best would be my father to answer that question, just because he would be able to give you the gory details. But there is a Martyrology. Religious people, Orthodox, who did not play to the tune of the regime, and they were imprisoned and they were killed and they were starved. And I have a very good friend from Oxford who wrote a few years ago, actually, wrote a wonderful study called Between Suicide and Sacrifice, on Petru Tuțea, who is a huge figure, religious figure in Romania. So I'll tell you an anecdote with this. So my husband and I were married in Modena, in an Orthodox church by an Italian pastor who turned Orthodox after falling in love with a Greek woman who was Orthodox. Okay. Now he said, whenever your book is translated into Italian, I want to know it. I want to read this book, because you are talking about, in our conversation, about this very complicated relationship between the church and its people via the government, mediated by the government. He understood everything because he's got a lot of Romanians coming to that church. What happened was this, and it's very complicated to explain. The Orthodox religion was tolerated as a cultural heritage, but not as an actual experience of this is a truth. Religion is truth, God really exists, and then we read the book of the Bible and in a church, and we learn how to behave ourselves, okay? But in order to be tolerated, the priests had to control their communities and bring them to pray for Ceausescu and the regime. There are always prayers for the communist government, that they run the country well. In school, we are being taught, I mean, there is also pre-communism, yes, and the tradition is quite old. So the communists had to incorporate a way of viewing religion when they came to power. Then there is the Marxist-Leninist doctrine that teaches you that, to be an atheist, because that's the modern way of being, and you're not ruled by superstitions and emotions and the God. Both systems are very authoritarian, let me tell you that. I mean, they're not that much different. When you come we're not allowed, for example, to read the Bible ourselves. Because they said if you touch the Bible, especially if you were a woman, you'll go to hell. Or you turn into a mouse, I think it was. There are all these superstitions that were going on in, at least in my village. I can't talk for all the Romania. Again, I cannot talk for all the Romania because you'll get another Romanian who had a different experience in their village, in their part of the country, and it would be very strong experience, also true. So we have incorporated the religious doctrine that was allowed with the atheist system. But behind that was yet an older generation, like my grandparents, like their parents, who were traditional Orthodox people and who have blended different kinds of spirituality. If you see in my book there is the ritual of the House of Straw, which is half pagan, half ritual, really, if you come to think of it. I mean, you give in this life to people what you want to have in heaven, and then you physically just give things to people in a little house of straw. But the metaphor works because it's the way you behave in this life is how God will judge you when you go to heaven. Yes? So it was as it was in Russia. In Russia, you still find, we have some friends from Oxford who are fascinated with Russian culture. They're Russianists and religion. And, the lady is one of my old professors. They went to the church in Russia, and they said, okay, well, fine. On the one hand, they were very atheist, and everybody went to church in jeans and kind of visited like a museum. But then there were very deeply traditional churches where she was not allowed to get into a church unless she wore a skirt. She covered a long skirt to cover her legs, and she wore a scarf. They were and they were saying she's an absolute sinner if she goes that. So you have all of these, like I said, you have an array of behavior that stems from the fact that they were trying to strangle the religious experience and impose a new system of thinking. And they cohabited to the point. You also remember that in my book, because you said you read it there is a priest, in fact, who goes and cuts the microphones. It's a priest who goes and cuts the microphones, cuts the cables of the secret police. Why? Because he is allowed. He is a man of God. He can be tolerated for playing stupid, because, the microphones are in a church, and he knew very well. And why did he do that? Because as a child, the culture of confession that I had from my grandparents, quite similar to the Catholic confession, actually. I want to confess, but in a sense, I want to just empty my heart, to just tell him that, look, we're really sad, we're really scared, there are microphones everywhere. And he felt sorry for me, because I was a kid. And so he decided to take a moral decision. And that was, I'm sure he had a lot to do with that. It was, so that's a very complicated relationship. Whereas I want to point to you, my English teacher, when I went to Romania to look at the files, I'll give you a contrast to that experience. My English teacher, when he found out that I would be there in 2010, he made a call to my aunt and to my uncle. Speaking about experiences we don't share, he said, I need to see Carmen alone, because I have something on my conscience for 23 years that I need to deal with her. So I went and I met him with my son and my husband in the park in a city center there. And he said, well, I even wrote a play about this. You must read it. He said, he wrote a play about this, not me. He said, I wanted to tell you that when I saw that you were being kept home for interrogations at the age of 12, and from the schoolroom, we could see the secret police in the bell tower at the church, changing shifts, watching from the bell tower what was happening in your room. He said, I saw you particularly one day, completely downtrodden. I mean, mind you, I was starved for 3 weeks, completely downtrodden, he said, I looked at you on a street and I didn't have the courage to say to you that your father was a good man. And I didn't have the courage to say to you that you'll be okay. He said, and I'm sorry. I want to apologize. 23 years later. I mean, this is more like 30 years later after the fact, because I was 12, you know? So that kind of courage didn't always exist in everyone. This is going beside the point that you're asking, but I wanted to share that story with you. It was extraordinary. I mean, I looked at him and I said, sure, no problem. I forgive you. Huh, what can I do? It was like that with everyone then, you know? Funny thing, but the Romanian teacher was the one who fed me sandwiches under the pretext that she was punishing me. She was feeding me, the Romanian language teacher, she was feeding me sandwiches, and she was the one responsible for me living, and also believing that literature can save people. I believe that literature might not be, you know, of a noble-minded always, but is noble, because I think something good happens there when people read books.
We can take some more questions, I think, but I do need to get a few things right before we go any farther. Those of you who are my students, be sure to sign in before you leave. I don't know where the sign-in sheet is. Okay, so that's before you leave. Also, you should know that Carmen's book is available in the back. Several people have already asked me. It's available for $16. They want check, cash, or credit card. So we see him back there, and he'll talk to you if you want to go that route. Other than that, anybody else?
Yeah, please. Yeah, there was another one? Yeah. I'll just answer it like this, or I'll just wait for people. Yeah.
Carmen, when did you realize that you wanted to be a professional writer? When was that moment that it just really sparked?
Yes, and I didn't tell you that. It's a whole story of the poem of the divorce. Now, that's a good story. So I started writing poetry when I was 8 years old, just to please my mom. You know, this is what everybody did, and kids made up little rhymes. So I was just making little rhymes around. And she used to say, find me a rhyme for this, find me a rhyme for that. But then something happened. After my father was in prison, I don't know how, inside of me, how it happened, but I would look at the photos of him on the wall. And one time in particular, I took one of his photos from the wall. I brought it and I sat down on a cement in a courtyard, in front of the house. And I wrote a poem to my father. Because we had the microphones in a house, we couldn't read it aloud. So I wrote it, and I passed the poem around to my mom and my sister, who said, this is your father. You're bringing him alive. He is back with us. You're doing it. And that was when I knew that my job is to be a writer. Because what I was doing there is, in a silence that we were experiencing, I found a way to articulate family suffering and also heal it at the same time. Articulation and healing. And that's what writing has been the meaning of writing to me for the rest of my life. And I discovered it there. And then the significant moment that happened even more was the divorce. When we came after the forced divorce from the courthouse, my mother wanted to clean the kitchen windows with newspapers. And so she said, you go and clean the porch window. So she gave me, because in Romania you could only do it with the newspapers, you kind of went like on a window and they were quite dusty and stuff. So I went on a window like this, and I wrote dead with my finger on it. And then I started writing the poem because I knew I couldn't talk aloud. We had just had the most horrifying experience of our lives, okay? It took 3 policemen to unstick me from my father. I didn't want to let go. And my father still remembers to this day that he caressed his young son with his chains. This is what he will tell you if he was standing in front of me. And I had to let it out. So there was and then my mother came to me and she said, here's a pencil and a piece of paper. And I wrote the poem of the divorce, which is in your book, which is in this book here. In there, the voice of a child is speaking directly to the father. That poem has been confiscated with a manuscript. That poem was remembered by my sister and my mother when we came here, and I translated a little bit into English when I first came. And then when I started dreaming in English, I wrote it straight into English in David's class. It was an oath of love. Then he went back to the divorce and more things like that. And then finally it has made it to the final form in this book, in Crossing the Carpathians, to the form that you have it. And there, it's art. There is the artist coming very strongly. I'm changing perspective. At one point, I'm talking directly in a poem as me. At the other point, I'm saying his children were breathing against the wall. I'm shifting perspectives from the first to the third person, just so I give you the bigger image, you know? So it's kind of like the time and the language, the linguistic distance, have been affording this space in which I can, like, again, to turn the mess of life into art. So, and then, so of course, yeah, that was a long story, but that was how I knew. And for me, it's profession. You know, I write a poem, my family reads it, and you know, it's like this. It's I seem to speak for everyone in my family, you know.
Thank you for sharing.
Hello. I'm sure when you were about 19 when you moved here, correct?
Yeah.
When you were 19, so you were a teenager at that time. What type of culture shock did you experience coming into the American school systems with us as teenagers growing up very free-spirited, saying what's on our mind, very little inhibitions, in contrast to what you were used to from your country?
Well, on a serious note, it was really being free to speak and letting go and trusting people. That act of trust I was talking about at the airport was a very big one. But the hilarious stuff, oh, only the people from church can tell you about the hilarious stuff. I mean, you guys took us in a van for the first time to Myers, and we saw the mountain of apples there. We walked into Myers, and those double doors open up all by themselves. I mean, wow, all by themselves. And then we saw all the green apples and all the red apples, and my father said, oh, they brought all the apples from America here because we're here. We are shocked. It was amazing. And then you took us, I remember very well, because you also took us in a van to see in North Can Mall, to see the TVs. And we saw ourselves on those cameras on the TVs. So we're going like this, looking at ourselves. The abundance was incredible. The other thing that we did, talk about cultural shock, the consumerism, the materialism, we are taking notes on all the TV commercials. The people from the church donated a TV to us, you know, a nice TV. So we sat in a living room taking notes to buy everything that was in a TV commercial. And I think at some point, somebody felt sorry for us and said, you don't have to take notes on this, you'll find them in a store. It doesn't mean that they're important, but we thought they were important. I mean, it was incredible, you know. And then my father, I explained this to my mother-in-law now, and to my husband, is you know, wonderful things my father used to do, other than also going on a motorway, on a highways, on the exit line and freaking everybody out. I mean, that was, but what we used to do, we used to drive around the banks, drive-through banking. That was so much fun. My dad and I did that so many times. We used to go around on banks and check our accounts and get the money out of bank just to see it go with the thing. And then we used to write letters to everybody in Romania, you know, saying, wow, these people have money coming out of the walls. This is amazing. This is the best country in the world. I mean, it was hilarious. I mean, and then I was in your class. I was asking some quite shocking questions in your class. I remember, you know, how things are and why things are this way. So yeah, cultural shock, big time.
Then you had the other side of the coin, which was when you'd spent a year in Ireland and came back, and it was how brazen the commercialism was.
Yeah.
Because that taught you the closeness of community again.
Yeah. After the year in Ireland, coming back here was a complete shock again, because people here, you know, driving very fast, going very fast, trying to buy everything, and the definition of self-worth is very closely related to what you own, you know. So, and we're trying to teach my son this, my husband, and I mean, my husband is a scientist, and you know, and I'm a poet, so you can imagine our income is not very high. And but we're very happy, and we're trying to teach my son that he is very rich in the love we have in a family, that he's got a sister with him, because there where we live in Geneva, all of his friends only go to the birthday parties. They have 2 incomes from CERN, and so they have proper villas with everything. And so my son knows the difference, you know, Mommy, but we're not rich with money, he says. I'm like, boy, you're a bit too young for that, but there you go. You know, we live in a Western world where those things are important, you know. And so we are very, I think my sister and my brother have become much more American than me. Having returned to Europe, I returned to smaller communities, you know, live for less, talk more, you know, stuff like this. Whereas they've been hardworking trying to accumulate. You know, my sister has a beautiful house in Ann Arbor, and we all feel like we're going in a castle when we visit her. So, but that was quite shocking, again, you know, coming back. And every time I come from Europe here, you know, I must admit something also. I shouldn't admit this in public, but, you know, when we come here, we also do shopping for our kids. You know, we go to the malls and we buy the clothes because things are so expensive in Europe, you can't really afford to buy them. So we go and we buy, you know, a set of clothes for the next season for our children, because here people really want to have, and people, it's that kind of culture you have.
Sure.
Growing up in the village.
Pickled tomatoes, pickled melons, cucumbers. Learn how to take the eggs from the hen's butts, you know, to collect the, milking the cow with 2 fingers, with a full hand. Daily chores, feeding the pigeons and feeding the chickens in a yard with my grandmother. Learning when not to annoy the turkey and when not to annoy the cow. I mean, everything that has to do with making stuff yourself to do this. All of the practical stuff, all of the very, very practical. One thing that I had to learn quite young was to take water from the well. It was a dangerous job because it had the chain. So if you're not careful, when the chain goes down, you can go with it. Do you know what I mean? And you can fall into the well, and there are many accidents like this. So especially you had to step on a stone step. So I had to learn how to take the water from the well, not to hurt my hands and stuff like this. Shoveling snow. And making jams in a yard. I mean, learning how to stir the big pot of plum jam. There are all of those things that you have to do everything the right way and everything. And I think my grandma tried, but she wasn't successful at teaching me how to do the spinning of the wool. To make from the wool, you know, you wash it, you dry it, and you make from the wool, you make the threads that you later, and I never learned the knitting and stuff like this. My sister did. She just knitted clothes for her daughters because out of the memory. But yeah, you have to learn how to do the knitting, sewing, making your own bed linens. That was something that we had to do, bed linens, tablecloths. This was all done in a family. It's not like you go to the store to do that. And also, a very important skill for a girl in particular to do is making your own clothes. Seamstresses are very important. And so, and my mother, you know, was quite a good seamstress. She, you know, you just go and picked our materials and she made our clothes. And that was a very important thing to do.
I think what we could do is, if you want to continue for a little bit, I